So photosynthesis, plant reproduction. We have got quite a few sliders today, so I do recommend having a device with you where you can access those questions. It's going to be a bit more interactive today. We have some past paper questions as well, and we'll just go through the content slowly. Great. So these are the big topics that we will be going through. As you can see, there's 4 main ones, but I'm going to focus a bit more on photosynthesis and plant reproduction. But as you know, we'll be going through everything a bit, just not so much depth on every single topic. And here are the learning objectives for today, and the ones in red are the ones that I'm focusing more on, because I just think they're a bit more unfamiliar to everyone, or to most people at least. So it would definitely help to know those a bit more. Great. So photosynthesis. Get the slide up. So photosynthesis is a reaction that occurs within plant cells, and it's specific to plants, or basically it doesn't happen in animal cells, but it's quite specific to plant cells. And the main aim of photosynthesis is to produce glucose. So glucose is necessary for plants for all sorts of reasons, and there'll be things like, let's see if my pen's going to work. So we use glucose in plants for, oops, I don't know why this is. Sorry about my writing, guys. It's a different trackpad today because I'm not at home, so it's not working quite as well as I'd hoped it would. But glucose is essentially used for, oh, that's really annoying. Glucose is essentially used for making starch. I think I just have to go a little bit slow. So making starch, which is the storage, the way that carbohydrates are stored within plants, and also making something called cellulose, which is another store of carbohydrates. But cellulose, I'm sure some of you are a bit more familiar with this, or possibly have heard it before in the context of cell walls in plant cells. So remember, one of the distinguishing features of plant cells from animal cells is the fact that plant cells have cell walls, and these are made of cellulose, which is a structural component. It's made up of carbohydrates, and it's kind of like scaffolding on the outside of a cell just to give it a bit more structure and a bit more shape. So the carbohydrate, glucose, essentially, is then used in the production of cellulose, which obviously is important for plant cells because of their function in cell walls. Glucose is also used to make lipids. So again, that's an energy store, and we'll come to this in a second. But when plant cells make when plants make seeds, the seeds obviously need some kind of energy source, and that comes from the lipids that are stored within the seed. So glucose is used to make those lipids. And then finally, something that we all know, glucose is needed for something that I hope you're all familiar with. I'm really, really sorry about my writing again, guys. This is not quite how I'd practice this. Respiration. That's really not that great. I'll try and fix that in one of the breaks, but hopefully you can read that as respiration. So remember, respiration is when we use glucose and oxygen, and we make carbohydrates and water. We make carbon dioxide, and water. And we also make energy in the form of something called ATP, which is what we need in our bodies. And plants also, in a similar way, need ATP, so they also go through respiration. But those are the 4 main things that glucose is used for. And as you can see there, that is the formula for photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide plus water gives us glucose and oxygen, and it uses light energy to do so. And I really, really recommend that you memorize that balanced equation at the bottom there, just because it's a lot easier than having to balance the equation yourself in the middle of the exam, especially because it's quite a straightforward, almost simple, more of a simple kind of form, like balancing, if you will. So let me just get the slider up. I've got a quick question for everyone just to get you started. So we'll wait for that to come up. Can everyone? Yes, there we go. Okay, so fill in the blank. So 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O using light energy gives us what plus 6 O2? So we know that it gives us glucose and oxygen, because remember the products of photosynthesis are glucose and oxygen. But which of these is the correct balanced equation and the correct formula for glucose. So a bit of a test here, and I'll give you a tip to remember what it is after everyone's answered the question. So make sure you can join that Slido, scan the QR code, or use the code at the bottom there and get answering. So I'll wait until we've got about 70 responses. We've got 12 so far. So if you know the answer, make sure you answer it. And even if you don't, try and guess it. Try and have a think back to what you can remember from photosynthesis. Remember, you've all done this before. You all know that it is glucose. Try and think back to what the chemical formula for glucose is. So some of these might look right, some of these might not, and try and use a process of elimination as well. To figure out which ones you think it might not be, and then eventually you can get to where you think they might be, which the correct answer is. So we've only got 12 responses. It'd be really, really great if everyone could try and answer, or as many of you as you can. So I'll give it a couple more minutes and then we'll move on. But there is quite a lot to get through today, so I don't want to spend too long on this. For some reason it's not updating on slides. Anyway, so most of you have said C6H12O6, and that is the correct answer. Oh, it's just mine. Yeah, that's the correct answer. So most of you overwhelmingly have chosen the right one. So that's really, really great. Let's go back to our slides. Let's hope that works. Oh, so my display here isn't really updating it. Sorry, guys, just a few technical problems. I'm trying to, yeah, I've been trying to do something new and it's not really helped. Just a second. Ooh, okay, I'm gonna have to change some stuff. Yeah, sorry, just give me a second here. Okay, so can you all? Yeah, okay. I'm not going to be able to use the trackpad at the moment, but I'll try and fix that in a second. Anyway, yes, so all of you are correct. I'm sorry for the technical problems. Hopefully it won't continue throughout. I'll make sure it's fixed on one of the breaks. Yes, you're all correct. C6H12O6, as we can see right here, is the formula for glucose. So memorize that, because I think the other ones, obviously, you know that carbon dioxide is CO2, water is H2O, and oxygen is O2. I think everyone's quite familiar with that, but glucose is usually the tricky one that we don't quite remember all the time. Oh, sorry, guys. Okay. Okay, sorry, my screenshot stopped sharing. I'll get that back up now. Okay, great. There we go. hopefully you can all see that. I'm sure the moderators will let me know if there's any issues with that. But let's get back to presentations. Yeah, so no more interruptions. So sorry about all of that. But yeah, we finished with this. So hopefully you're all a bit happy with the equation for photosynthesis. You know what goes into it, what comes out of it. And remember, the main point is to get that glucose. Glucose is the main product that we need. And you can see why light energy is so important, because it is what triggers this entire reaction to happen. So in a plant cell, again, we've been through the organelles within a plant cell, there is something called a chloroplast. And chloroplasts within the plant cell are these. So that's the cell wall on the outside. So that's the wall, and inside is the membrane. And you've got these organelles that kind of sit, they almost look like mitochondria in a way, but they're green and they are chloroplasts, and the chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, and that chlorophyll is a substance that can absorb light energy, which is why photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. And again, just important things to remember in terms of that. Great. So now that we've been through photosynthesis, I just wanted to go through the structure of the leaf, because I think this is another one where we're not quite so familiar with it because it only comes up in this topic. It's not something that's repeated again and again. So we'll go through this as well. And I've got a few questions for you here. So you can see there's quite a few different structures. We've been through this before as well. So they should be a bit familiar. At the top here, so this is a cross section of a leaf. So if you take a leaf, imagine this post-it is a leaf. We've basically chopped through it sideways, and we're looking at a cross section now. And obviously this would all be done with a microscope because it's so thin and so tiny that you won't be able to see anything with the naked eye. So we've got the top layer here, which is the waxy cuticle. And then underneath that, we've got the epidermis, but there are two layers of epidermis. You've got one at the top of the leaf, which is the upper epidermis, and then we've got one at the bottom called the lower epidermis. And sandwiched between these are something called a palisade mesophyll, or the palisade layer, and it contains these palisade cells, which is, you can see they're quite bright green there. And underneath those, we've got something called the spongy mesophyll, or the spongy layer, and these are these like irregularly shaped, squishy cells almost. And then, like I said, we've got the lower epidermis there, and then we've got the wax cuticle again. But within that lower epidermis, there are these cells called guard cells, and these are really, really important to help control the stomata, or the singular stoma here. And we'll talk about each of these structures one by one. Now, what's really important to remember with the structure of a leaf is that each layer or each aspect of this leaf is adapted to allow for the most effective photosynthesis possible. Because the point of a leaf, obviously, is to be part of a plant, but the reason why plants have leaves, one of the main reasons why, is so that they can photosynthesize and produce enough glucose for the rest of the plant to survive. So the leaf is essentially what's making the food for the plant. And that's why each and every single structure within this leaf is adapted to allow for the most effective photosynthesis, like I said. So when you get exam questions about the structure of the leaf, obviously it's good to know which one is where and understand, kind of in your mind, have this image where you can tell, like, oh, that the waxy cuticle is the topmost layer, and then this comes after that, and so on. But one of the main things that they'll ask you in an exam is to be able to apply that knowledge and to be able to say, yes, the waxy cuticle is the topmost layer, and this is what it does, and this helps photosynthesis by doing this. You need to be able to apply what you know. So it's not just about memorizing this diagram right here. It's about knowing what's going on, why they are the way that they are, what purpose they've got, and how that's going to ultimately help with photosynthesis. So to get us started, another Slido. How does the waxy cuticle help with photosynthesis? So either it absorbs CO2, it absorbs light, it reduces water loss, or it stops the leaf from being eaten. So which of these four is how the waxy cuticle helps with photosynthesis? So remember, scan that code or the QR code or join at slido.com and try and answer the question, because again, the more people who answer this, the better idea I've got of how much everyone's already aware of and how much time I need to spend doing each of these things. So make sure you try and answer. even if you don't really know the answer for sure, guess, because in an exam, the best thing you can do is just make an informed guess. Try and think about everything that you know and apply that to what might be the case in the situation. Just work through it. So the waxy cuticle is the topmost layer, as you saw in that diagram. So it's right at the top. When you see a leaf, usually the top feels quite smooth, and that smoothness is from the waxy cuticle. It's made of wax. So what do we think that might do? Use the name to give you some clues. See how many people are today. Great. Yes, we'll wait till we get about 60, 70-ish responses, and then we'll move on. Okay, a couple more. We'll get to 60 then, and I'll show you the answer. Okay, so I think that's enough. And most of you are correct. It is reducing water loss. So remember, wax or any oil-based substance, water isn't really, they don't mix together, water and wax, water and oil, water and fat, etc. They don't mix together. So water isn't really able to diffuse out of the leaf because this waxy cuticle basically is like a barrier that keeps it within the leaf. And reducing water loss helps with photosynthesis because, as you can remember, if you go back to the equation for photosynthesis, water is one of the reactants. So carbon dioxide reacts with water to then give us the products of photosynthesis. So we need as much water as we can get within the leaf. Okay, great. So great. So yes, the waxy cuticle, it's exactly what we talked about. It reduces water loss, and that's its main function. At the same time, it does have a protective factor as well. So it allows light in because it's transparent. It doesn't block the light from coming in, even though it does block the water from going out. And it's got a bit of a structural property. So it's kind of like putting it's a bit of a barrier for the leaf itself, so the actual cells underneath don't get too damaged. If they fall off somewhere or if they get trampled on, they're still a little bit more durable because of this waxy layer. Great, so the epidermis is this thin, transparent layer of cells. It's the upper epidermis here, but the lower epidermis is pretty much the exact same. And they just are thin and transparent. They allow light to pass into the palisade cells. So they're kind of there as a facilitator. They allow the light to go through. And again, they're pretty much there for structural support. If you think of your skin, so the upper layer of human skin is called your epidermis, or if it's just underneath. So you can, it's to act as a bit of protection, also to allow things to come in a little bit. So it's a bit more vague, but the main function again is to allow light to pass to these palisade cells underneath. Okay, so coming on to the palisade cells now, another slider for everyone. So how does the palisade layer help with photosynthesis? What do we think the palisade layer does? Why do we want that light to get there? So is it to allow carbon dioxide to pass into the leaf? Is it to absorb light, to produce water, or to structurally support the leaf? Which one do we think the palisade layer is doing within the leaf in regards to photosynthesis? Now remember, if you can think back to the diagram I had up before, the palisade cells they look different than the other ones. They're quite nice and regular and structured. So obviously the typical plant cell that you might picture, with a nice rectangular shape, big vacuole in the middle, and the cell wall and the cell membrane. But if you remember, they had lots of green within them, so lots of little green dots kind of plastered around. So try and think about what those green organelles might be and what they might do and how that could help you answer this question. Okay, again, we'll wait till we get to about 50, 60-ish. Okay, so we're going to stop there. And again, most of you are correct. The palisade layer absorbs light. So those green structures within the cells are chloroplasts. So remember I told you, chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, and it's that green pigment, the chlorophyll, that can absorb light and allow photosynthesis to occur. So photosynthesis happens within the chloroplasts, and that's why these palisade cells are the site of photosynthesis. So the main thing is that's where photosynthesis happens, and it happens because these cells are able to absorb more light energy because they've got more chloroplasts inside them. That's their distinguishing feature. Okay, so the palisade layer is responsible for photosynthesis. Great. And next we are going to be looking at the stomata. So we're going to kind of jump a few layers now. Instead of going down to the spongy layer, we're going to go straight to the stomata down there, because everything else kind of happens from the bottom up now. So I'll show you what exactly that means. So the stomata are basically an opening found in the bottom of a leaf. So if you think about the underside of a leaf, it's usually a little bit rougher, and that's because there's these tiny microscopic little holes quite regularly around the leaf, and it just gives it a bit more of a rough texture. And these openings are to allow gas to enter the leaf, because remember, one of the main reactants or reagents of photosynthesis, one of the main substances that we need for the reaction to even happen is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is a gas, so it comes from the atmosphere. So the stomata allow the gas to pass inside the leaf, and therefore you've got this carbon dioxide inside to start reacting with water, with light energy, to have photosynthesis occur. Now, the guard cells are also really, really important, and I mentioned this before. So the guard cells are these little structures here. Both of these represent guard cells. Now, guard cells control the opening and closing of the stomata, because imagine if the stomata were always open. Yes, gas can get in, but gas can also get out. And the main gas we're worried about escaping is water vapor, which is basically like a gaseous version of water. We don't want water vapor to leave the cell because we need that water retained within the cell to allow photosynthesis to occur. So the way that guard cells work is they open up when there's more light energy, because it means that if there's light energy present, then photosynthesis is able to happen. There's no point allowing carbon dioxide into the leaf when there's no light energy, because then no photosynthesis will occur. And at the same time, you're also losing that water vapor. So the guard cells are really, really particular, and they only open up when there's enough light energy. As you can see here, in light conditions, they open up because that means that, yes, carbon dioxide is coming in, yes, we've got the light energy, and even if we lose a little bit of water, it's okay because we have everything else that we need, and hopefully we'll have enough water for that reaction to go on as well. But then as soon as it gets dark, the guard cells close, and then preventing any carbon dioxide from coming in, also preventing the loss of any water vapor. So that's why the guard cells are really important. They literally do what their name is. They guard the stomata, they guard the entry points of the leaf. And the way that guard cells work is by absorbing different amounts of water or losing water, for example. And this will make more sense as we come on to cell transport, but hopefully you've got a bit of an idea about turgidity and flaccidity. So guard cells become turgid when they absorb water via osmosis, because they are able to take in more water, and that means they get fuller, the vacuole gets fuller, and they become a bit more stiff, and that makes them kind of open up a bit more. But then when they lose water in dark conditions, they become flaccid, they kind of go a bit loose and a bit wobbly almost, quite weak, and that means that they close together because they don't really have the strength to stay open, they just automatically close. So that's how guard cells and the stomata work. Okay, and then finally, we're going to be looking at the spongy layer, which is this little layer here, right underneath the palisade layer and above the lower epidermis. And that it's quite a unique layer because it doesn't really have a very structured shape. You can see they're really, really irregular cells. They literally just look like sponges that you'd find in your kitchen. And they are basically air spaces where carbon dioxide can diffuse into the leaf and gas exchange can occur. So remember, the product of photosynthesis is oxygen, and it uses up carbon dioxide. So the way that in the human body, in our lungs, we've got gas exchange, where we try and take in oxygen and try and breathe out carbon dioxide, because that's the waste product. In this case, it's the opposite. So oxygen is the waste product and carbon dioxide is what is needed. So in the spongy layer, you have gas exchange where carbon dioxide is exchanged for oxygen that's leaving the leaf. And that's pretty much the only purpose of the spongy layer. There's not really much else that it's involved in, but that's its main thing. So that's the main thing that you need to remember. Okay, so now that we've been through the structure of the cell, before we have a quick summary, let's see how much everyone knows about the structure of plant leaves. So we've got a quick Slido quiz, and remember, quizzes are where you join, you get more points for obviously getting the question right and also for answering quickly. And the faster you answer, the more points you get, the more likely you are to win, because we have a leaderboard, we can see who gets the most points by the end of it. So make sure you join the quiz and we can get started. Okay, great. So again, we'll wait till we get about 50 people, and that just means that we've got enough people for it to be a real competition. Okay, a couple more people, guys, and then we can get started. So try and think back to what we've been doing so far. We've looked at the structure of the leaf. Try and learn what those different layers are and why they're so important for photosynthesis, because that's what these questions will be testing you on. Okay, let's get started. So, question number 1. What is the uppermost structure of the leaf? Is it the guard cells, stomata, upper epidermis, the waxy cuticle? Remember, the faster you answer, the more points you get as well. So you really want to be on it with these questions. And this one's more of an easy one to start off with. All you have to do is try and think back to that diagram. Okay, seems like almost everyone's answered. We'll wait for a few more people. But I'm going to lock it soon, so if you want to answer, get it in now. Okay, I'm locking that question. So most of you said the waxy cuticle, and most of you would be correct. Yes, it's the waxy cuticle, it's the uppermost structure. Remember, the upper epidermis comes just under that, and the guard cells are actually in the lower epidermis there, in that lower layer. And that they work with the stomata, which is right at the bottom of the leaf. Okay, next question. So there's only 3 questions, I think, here. So which cells work with the stomata? I kind of just skip this away, I forgot that was a question. So if you did hear me, well done, you were paying attention. And if not, try and think about which cells work with stomata. Remember what the stomata are, they're openings in the bottom of the leaf. So which cells are kind of responsible for how that happens? Okay, so most of you have answered, let's lock that in. Yeah, pretty much everyone has said guard cells, and yes, they're guard cells. So I can understand why some of you would say spongy cells and palisade cells, because obviously the stomata are allowing carbon dioxide into the leaf so that photosynthesis can happen. And in that way, you're correct. Yes, all the cells in the leaf work together to allow photosynthesis to generally be really, really effective. But specifically, the guard cells are what work directly with the stomata because the guard cells control how open or how closed the stomata are. And the epidermis is, the lower epidermis is kind of where guard cells are embedded, but they're usually surrounding the stomata. So that's how that one works. And then final question, where does gas exchange occur? Epidermis, palisade layer, spongy layer, or stomata? This is the last question, so make sure you answer super duper fast because this might be your chance to get ahead and find your place on the leaderboard at the end. Okay, so I think most people have answered, so I'm going to lock that in now. A bit more mixed. So some people are saying spongy layer, some people are saying stomata predominantly, and the correct answer is the spongy layer. So actually, remember we're talking about the function of each one of these structures. Yes, gas comes in through the stomata, but exchange doesn't really happen there. It's almost just like a door that opens up. But the actual gas exchange that happens is within that spongy layer. It's where carbon dioxide swaps places with the oxygen to get inside the leaf. So that's not the stomata. Stomata just allows everything in and everything out as well. It's just an opening in the leaf. The spongy layer is where the actual exchange happens. Okay, so now everyone's been waiting for the leaderboard. Let's see who's done best. So N, well done. But as you can see that they're really, really similar times. You all got the questions correct. And looking at everyone here, actually most people got everything right, or at least 2 points, which is amazing. And I'm really, really glad that everyone's a bit more confident with that stuff. So we can move on. So quick summary of everything there. You can see all of it happen. And yeah, you're all experts at this now. You all did really, really well on that quiz. So we'll move on. So that's what we've done so far today. Now, a quick mention about limiting factors and measuring the rate of photosynthesis. So when we look at, obviously we need to know how or what kind of things are impacting photosynthesis because we need to know how that's going to impact the plant. Obviously, the more photosynthesis a plant can take part in, the better, the healthier the plant will be and vice versa. So if we can understand why some things might improve photosynthesis, some things might worsen it, we can begin to understand what conditions are necessary for plants. So we can look at different things in a lab to actually measure the rate. And obviously, remember the rate is equivalent to how well the reaction is happening. So if you think about it, obviously photosynthesis we know is carbon dioxide plus water using light energy gives us glucose and oxygen. But to measure, that's obviously the overall reaction. But this is a minuscule reaction that's happening. There's millions of reactions happening in each and every cell for photosynthesis. So the rate is basically telling us how many of those reactions are happening at a given time. The more reactions that occur, the better the rate. That means the more photosynthesis is going on. And then the less reactions that are occurring at any given time, that means the lower the rate and the worse the actual effectiveness of photosynthesis is going on. So we look at the rate. And we can do this by looking at how much oxygen is given out because oxygen is a product, remember? So if we know that actually lots of oxygen is being produced by a particular leaf, then we know that that means lots of photosynthesis is going on there. And the same thing with CO2 uptake, the more carbon dioxide that's being used, the more photosynthesis is occurring. And again, like oxygen, carbohydrate production, because obviously the more products, the more glucose that's being made, the more photosynthesis that's occurring. And this is kind of a look at the things that are affecting that rate. So we can measure it using these three different measures, these three components of the reaction. You can see how much is happening, but these are the real things that are actually affecting what's going on within each cell, why is photosynthesis changing. So they're all quite self-explanatory. The more light there is, the more photosynthesis that occurs because we need more light for a reaction to take place. But as you can see, it starts to level off after a while. And that really happens because of things that we call limiting factors. So a limiting factor is anything, let me try and write that on, I don't have a trackpad, this is going to be a bit difficult. But limiting factors. Okay, so limiting factors are they are things that are affecting the rate of photosynthesis that can, if there's not enough of that factor, will limit the rate of photosynthesis. So each one of these things here, as you can see on these graphs, are limiting factors, light intensity being one of them. But like I said, the more light intensity you've got, the more photosynthesis occurs. It levels off after a while because no matter how much light you've got, if there's something else that's limiting the reaction, then that cannot increase. So for example, when we do these kinds of reactions, when we're looking at the differences between different factors, we have to keep things as balanced and as controlled as possible. So if we're looking at the effect of different amounts of light intensity on the rate of photosynthesis, everything else has to be the same, including CO2 concentration. So at some point, yes, obviously it's increasing, but then at this point here, it's telling us that yes, no matter how much light you've got, you don't have enough carbon dioxide to fulfill that the requirement for photosynthesis. Because yes, you've got loads and loads of light going in, and if we think back to our actual equation, you've got lots of light, but you don't have enough carbon dioxide to be using all that light you've got, and that means that eventually it's going to halt no matter what. Because you only have the same amount of carbon dioxide as you did before. I'll write this in just because I think I'll keep referring to it. So that's 06 there, and 02. And to balance that, we have the 6s in front of these, and there's just one glucose. Anyway, so we can have as much light as we want, but because there's only so much carbon dioxide, nothing else is going to happen if we've used up all that carbon dioxide in the first place, and it levels off because of that. And the same thing happens when we look at the CO2 concentration. So in this case, the light intensity will be kept the same. So yes, it increases the more CO2 we've got, but at some point, we can have as much CO2 as we'd like, but there's just not enough light energy to allow all that CO2 to react with the H2O. And therefore, it starts to level off and we get a stagnant increase in the rate of photosynthesis. Temperature is always a little bit different. Temperature affects the energy that's within each of the molecules that's involved in the reaction. The higher the temperature, the more energy these molecules have, and therefore the more reactions are taking place because they can collide with each other a little bit more. But at some point we reach something called the optimum. So that's the optimum, I'll just call it O for now. The optimum temperature is the highest temperature at which you get the maximum rate of reaction. Anything after the optimum temperature, the enzymes that are involved in the reaction, every single reaction in biology, even if you don't know about them, has enzymes going on. Those enzymes start to denature, they change shape, and they aren't working anymore. And these molecules as well will start to kind of break down because they're just really, really high temperatures, and therefore you get a drop all the way back down to 0 in the rate of photosynthesis. And that's how limiting factors work. So each three of these things, limiting factors, restrict any one of them, and you can change the rate of photosynthesis that's occurring. Okay. So we've been through that quickly. Now a bit more time on plant reproduction, just because I think, again, this is another kind of unfamiliar one. So we've just got to go through plant reproduction and selective breeding, and then we'll take a quick break, and we've got some exam questions coming up after that. So we'll go through this in the next 10-15 minutes, and then we'll take a little bit of a breather, because I know that it can be a bit much, especially first thing on a Saturday morning. Okay, so when we look at plant reproduction, we know that there are two types of any reproduction in the world. We've got sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. And these are two things that I'm sure you've all come across before. You're all a bit familiar with them, you know kind of what goes on, and we'll go through each one a bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on asexual reproduction because it is quite straightforward at GCSE level. There's not really so much you need to know because it pretty much is just mitosis. but we'll go through benefits and disadvantages of each one, just so that you're aware of why they exist. Because I think in biology, a big question is always, why is this the way that it is? There's always a reason behind everything. There's a reason why some organisms will use sexual reproduction to reproduce, some will use asexual reproduction, and it would make sense for the context in which we're looking at each organism, which is why it's so important to understand why each one happens. So first, what is an advantage of asexual reproduction? Is it that less energy is needed, there's more protection against disease, or that there's a slow increase in population? Which one is an advantage of asexual reproduction? So remember, scan that code, join there. No one's replied yet, so I'm really hoping that this is working fine. There we go, good. So which one is an advantage? Wait till we get to 50, so about 10 more. So try and think about what asexual reproduction is. So like I said, it's mitosis. It's when the parent organism is replicating its cells enough to produce a different organism. And an example is strawberry runners. You know that if you can picture the plant in the soil, there are these like runners that kind of come off and they grow through mitosis. They grow and grow and grow and grow until they embed themselves in soil that's a little bit further away. And then that is the basis for a new plant. It grows roots, it grows more leaves, its own leaves, and it becomes a completely different plant, but it's got the exact same genetic makeup as the parent plant that it came from, because it reproduced via asexual reproduction. So it's basically a clone of the parent. So what might that do, or what might be a good thing about reproduction like that, that's advantageous to a species? Okay, so most of you said less energy needed. And again, most of you are correct. Yes, asexual reproduction, obviously when paying attention to the last few sessions, less energy is needed because it's just a single organism that is reproducing by itself. There's no mate that's needed. You don't have to go looking for someone else to reproduce with. It's just one organism making more cells as it usually would anyway, growing and then growing into a new plant completely. More protection against disease isn't necessarily a thing because in asexual reproduction, even though yes, less energy is needed, less time is needed, great. Every offspring would be exactly the same. And it means you get a population of genetically identical plants, and they all have the same genetic makeup. There's no genetic variation whatsoever. And it means that if one plant is really susceptible to a particular disease, all the plants will be, and they will all be wiped out, which is one of the disadvantages of asexual reproduction. And a slow increase in population, actually asexual reproduction has a fast increase of population. We don't want a slow increase because the goal for any population or any species is to reproduce as much as possible to have a big enough species that it's difficult to die out. So we want fast increase of population, and actually asexual reproduction does give us a faster increase in the population. Great. And then the next question, if it comes up, oh, let me stop that. Okay. So what is an advantage of sexual reproduction? Yes, I got some answers already. So which one is an advantage of sexual reproduction now? So everyone answer as quickly as you can, because it seems like everyone's pretty much got the hang of this stuff, and then we can move on. Let's get a few more answers in. But yeah, I pretty much answered this in the last one. So one of the advantages of sexual reproduction this time is actually, yes, we got the inverse, we get a genetically diverse population. There's lots and lots of variation. It means that there's lots of different characteristics within the same population, the same species, which means that they have different likelihoods of surviving in different environments. One predator or one disease won't wipe everyone out because everyone's slightly different and has different characteristics that could be advantageous or disadvantageous. Sexual reproduction can't happen anywhere because you need two organisms basically reproducing together, and that can't happen anywhere. If there's an organism that's isolated, they won't be able to reproduce. And sexual reproduction doesn't result in a rapid increase in population because it takes time. It takes time and energy to find a mate and to then, or to find another plant, for example, or for enough pollination to occur for plants to be able to reproduce sexually. And that's why it can take a bit longer. It requires more time, more energy, but it does result in a very, very diverse population, which is great for any species because it means they're more likely to survive. Great. So that's pretty much what I talked about here. These are the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. And you can see that the same table for sexual reproduction is pretty much the opposite of asexual. So what is advantageous for asexual reproduction usually is something that isn't it's not possible during sexual reproduction, so it's a disadvantage of that, and vice versa. And that's all the time I'm going to spend on that, just because I want to spend a bit more time on talking about sexual reproduction within plants, because it's quite different to what happens in animals. That's all really, really important to know about. So before we properly start that, we need to get acquainted with the different parts of the flower. So in a flower, we've got, obviously, well, plants produce flowers basically for reproduction. So I usually like to compare it to human reproduction as much as possible, just because it makes me have it in a bit more context. It's a bit easier to understand what's going on. So in human reproduction, we obviously know that you need a male and a female because you need a sperm cell and an egg cell to join together, and that creates the embryo that becomes the offspring. Similarly, in plants, you've got a male part of the plant and a female part of the plant, but the difference is each plant has both a male part and a female part. So you don't really get male plants and female plants. They both contain like what's known as a male part of the plant and the female part of the plant. So the male part of the plant is the stamen. So these long kind of, hopefully you can see my mouse, these, let me get a different printer. There we go. So you've got the stamen here, and they kind of come off the middle there. And at the top, they've got something called the anther. And the anther is the part of the stamen that produces pollen. And I like to think of pollen to be the equivalent to sperm cells, because that's essentially what they are. They come from the male part. Oh boy. Oh God, ignore that. They come from the male part of the cell, and they are what travel around to meet the female part and then to produce the offspring. So the pollen is essentially the same as the sperm cells of the plant in a way. And then you've got the female part of the cell, which is kind of this entire middle part here. So you've got what's called a stigma, and the stigma is the top part of the plant or the top of the female part of the plant that collects the pollen. So you can almost think of this as the vagina, because it's where the pollen first meets the female part and then it's taken in to fertilize the egg cell in a way. And then you've got the ovary here where you get the ovule, and the ovule is kind of the equivalent of our egg cell. So we want the pollen to basically get to the ovule, and to do so it goes through the stigma. And I think that's quite a nice way of understanding the different structures, because otherwise it can be completely foreign. It looks very, very different to anything else that we know. So just comparing it to what we know happens in humans is really, really helpful. So we know that the same as the male part of the plant has the anther where the pollen is produced, and the pollen is kind of like the sperm. And then for the female part of the plant, we've got the stigma, which is kind of like the vagina. It's the top part of the female part of the plant. And it collects the pollen, and then underneath it, we've got the ovary where we have the ovule, and the ovule is kind of like the egg cell of the plant. But like I said, the main difference between plant sexual reproduction and human sexual reproduction is the fact that plants contain both the female and the male part within the same plant. So what happens is you don't really get the pollen going down the same stigma to the same to the ovule of the same plant. You would have the pollen from one plant fertilizing the ovule of another plant, and that happens through pollination, which we'll go through. Get some water. But yeah, it's basically what happens. You get sperm from one plant, or sorry, pollen from one plant, fertilizing ovules from a different plant. So it's not that it pollinates its own. It doesn't really work that way.